let's talk about medieval warbows. Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria. So I have spoken to some extent in the past about medieval warbows or longbows, depending which term you prefer, particularly the English kind. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But let's just say some basic facts about them. Incidentally, before I start, I'll just say full credit to Will Sherman, who's an excellent bowyer and arrow maker. I'll put a link below and to his stuff. And he sent me this longbow incredibly generously. It is English yew, made in the traditional way. It is a self bow. That means it's made of one piece of wood, and you'll see it's nice and knobbly. I have actually shown this in one video previously, but it is just a lovely, characterful lump of wood. And you can see it's lumpy and bumpy, and just how I like it. And when you look at medieval art, you'll see that quite a lot of the longbows or warbows shown in medieval art are lumpy and bumpy like this. They're not nice and smooth like this example here. But if most of you out there go out to shoot a longbow or buy a longbow, this is usually what you will encounter. Now I'm going to talk more about the differences between these two types of longbow in a minute, but just to establish some basic facts, okay? So what's often referred to as the English longbow, really, how do we define that? Well, quite simply, we know that the English were quite famous for using archers, particularly during the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses. That's widely known fact. What's perhaps not so widely known amongst the general public is that these sorts of longbows were actually used all over Europe. They weren't particular to the English, and additionally they weren't, in a way, in design, they weren't particular to the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. They were a type of bow that had been around for, I was going to say centuries, but probably even longer than that really, going back into prehistory. And in fact, if we look at the Nidam bog finds, for example, from Denmark, so we're looking back into almost, just after the Roman period, the early Dark Ages, we find bows that really structurally are very, very similar. They are made of various different types of wood. Sometimes you find bows from earlier periods that indeed were made of yew, but sometimes they used other woods. Most popularly, probably elm and ash were two of the most popular other types of wood to use. Is there a difference between yew, elm and ash? Well, yes, yew is better. Essentially, my understanding is it's usually stronger, and it reflexes faster. So I'll talk a little bit more about the physics in a second. So with a yew bow, in fact with any wood bow, what we aim to do is have a natural laminate. And you'll notice that if we look at the wood of this bow, it's light at the front, what's known as the back of the bow, and this is called the belly of the bow, and this is darker. And what that signifies is when you chop through a trunk or a section of wood, you have sapwood that's near the bark, near the outside of the tree, and then you have heartwood, which is more towards the middle of the tree, or it's the inner face, as it were, inner side of that. And what you're aiming to do is take the sections out of the wood to make your bows out of at that point in the wood where there's a junction between sap and heartwood, because that forms a natural laminate. Just like making a composite bow, in the modern world you'll often find wood used with fiberglass, for example, and usually the fiberglass will be on the back. Confusingly, it's called the back because it's actually the front. But the fiberglass is usually where the sapwood is here, and then the wood is usually here. Sometimes you find fiberglass on the other side as well. Fiberglass being very tough, it forms a sandwich with the wood in a modern bow. But really what you've got with one of these so-called self bows is a natural laminate. Is that better? No, not really. There's a certain amount of mysticism around longbows, and particularly yew longbows, in the same way that there's mysticism around Damascus steel and woots and these various, and Toledo steel and these various other things that we find in the sword world. But in actual fact, really all you get from a self yew bow is a pretty efficient laminate from a natural piece of wood. So it's actually relatively easy to source, relatively easy to make. It's fairly tough, fairly it's quite quick to make relatively compared to Middle Eastern recurve composite bows, for example, which take weeks or months of work and involve many different materials, including tendon, sinew, horn, all sorts of things. This is just a piece of wood from a tree, and you can make lots of them relatively quickly once the wood's been seasoned. So in actual fact, what you get with a longbow, with a medieval European bow made of one piece of wood, is an effective bow that's quick and relatively cheap to make. In terms of the yew itself, English yew was not regarded as the best at all. The best regarded yew was, generally speaking, from Italy or Spain. In medieval England, often merchants trading in, for example, London, were expected to pay a tax in order to be able to trade there, just like today. They all had to pay tax, unfortunately. And if they wanted to pay the tax, they could pay it, or sometimes they were told to pay it, if they were from Italy, for example, in bow staves. So the Italians actually had quite a vibrant trade in harvesting Italian alpine yew and turning it into bow staves. And the Wars of the Roses, a lot of the longbows used by English archers in the Wars of the Roses in England would have actually been Italian yew, or sometimes Spanish yew, not English yew. There wasn't an awful lot of yew in England, and the actual wood itself is, generally speaking, not as good, as I understand, not as dense, and therefore sort of pound for pound more efficient as the Alpine Italian and Alpine yew from Italy and yew from Spain. There were other woods that were imported. As I understand it, there were merchants coming from what's probably now modern day Poland that used to bring in elm, I think, and other woods. This is a subject I haven't read about for many years, so please excuse me if some of my facts are slightly skewed, but I do know for a fact that merchants from different areas did bring in different types of wood, and often they were pre-processed as bow staves. Now, in terms of what makes so we know that this type of bow is found all over Europe. Made out of one piece of wood using a natural laminate, and it spans a wide period of time. What makes the English so-called warbow particularly unusual or special is really not so much the bow as the bowman. So there was a culture, in fact by law, from at least Edward I's time. Does it go back to Henry III? I can't remember now. But at least Edward I's time, it was legally enforced in England that males between the age of 16 and 60 should practice archery. Now, obviously this makes good archers. It means that you have a greater pool of reasonably good archers to draw upon when you go to war than a country where there's no legal legally forced practice of archery. But additionally to that, it means that if there is a culture of people practicing with their weapons, we could say much like in America, perhaps with firearms culture in America, it does mean that the average level is better. But what does that mean in a medieval context with a bow? It doesn't only mean accuracy or rate of fire. Remember, there's no fire with a bow, but rate of fire is a useful expression. It also means that they could pull heavier draw weights. Now, what we do seem to see, particularly probably in the 14th century, is probably a ramping up of the poundage or draw weight, that is the amount of energy it requires to draw back the bow in England. It seems that English archers were described as not only being good, i.e. accurate, and also being able to shoot quickly, but they were also pulling probably heavier bows than their competitors. So there were longbowmen in France, there were longbowmen in Spain and Italy and other areas where English armies fought during the 14th and 15th centuries, but it seems that English archers probably were more professional as soldiers. Some of them were making a living out of being soldiers professionally, which was relatively unusual in that period. But additionally, they were probably on average better archers. Certainly if we go to areas like Turkey or Persia or Mongolia or perhaps even India or Japan, you probably also find, because they were very strong archery cultures, a similar thing. The average level of archery was very, very good. We know Turkish archers were famous all over the world. But it seems that at a certain period, English archers were as well. It probably comes down to practice. But it also comes down to power. Now, the self-wood bow made of yew is actually, perhaps by luck or by design, very able to be made up to very high draw weights or powers. And it does mean that you can make a bow that's like this out of one piece of wood that is 200 pounds draw weight. Now that is, there are only a handful of people in Britain at the moment who shoot bows of that power, who are physically able to shoot bows of that power. There's a larger group of people who are now shooting bows of sort of 120, 140 pounds draw weight. Now, if we look at the Mary Rose bows, which are the best source available of looking at original medieval English, or should we say late medieval, early Renaissance English warbows, it seems that the draw weights of those, most of them, were in the sort of 120, 140 pound draw weight range. This bow that I'm holding here, whilst it looks kind of right, is lighter. It's made for me to shoot recreationally, and therefore it's only 70 pounds. I do have a heavier bow, which I don't have out at the moment, which is closer to 90 pounds, but I used to shoot that when I did archery regularly, and I can't shoot it now because I don't do archery regularly. I find that without regular practice, 70 pounds is about what I can comfortably get back to my ear. Once I go above 70 pounds, once I get to sort of 80, 85, 90 pounds, I'm just struggling too much, and it's not nice for me to try and shoot that for more than 1 or 2 shots, to be honest. Whereas 70 pound bow I can shoot for a whole day. So this is a recreational bow for me, and probably is more representative of what maybe a gentleman in the 15th century England might have gone hunting with, I imagine. They probably weren't going hunting with, you know, 120 pound draw weight warbows, because you don't really need to. They were probably using things more like this, more like 70, 80 pounds. In terms of the power, the construction itself could be you just make it thicker, essentially. You just make it thicker and you tiller it such that it still has the correct curvature, and you end up with a bow that's much heavier in draw weight. Not all pieces of wood are capable of those very high draw weights. There is a failure rate when you're making these, and as you're so-called tillering the bow, that means shaping it and pulling the string repeatedly to see how the curvature's going as you're shaping it. Some bows don't make the grade and have to be reduced in weight because they're very clearly going to break at certain weights and this kind of thing. So definitely quality of wood and just luck comes into it as well. Now, one important thing, the main point I really want to finish up, I'm going to talk a lot more about these in future videos, but one of the things I really want to sort of conclude with in this video is there is a big difference between what's commonly these days called, at least on the internet, a warbow, and what most modern archers know as a longbow. Now, a longbow, what does it mean? It means a wooden long bow. Some people call American flat bows that are longbows, and you could call it an American longbow. In fact, when I was doing archery when I was a teenager, they were commonly known as American longbows. I would now call it a flat bow. Generally speaking, what I would call a longbow has a D section or sometimes oval section. And when I was growing up, most people doing longbow archery used these, and indeed this is what I used to use. Now, this is a different type of bow to that one. We'll talk about the comparison in a minute, but this, if we just look at it, has a very distinct D section, so it's got a flat back, or the bit that points away from you, and then it's got a hemispherical, half a circle, arched back, essentially, which points towards you, belly, which points towards you. It has, and we'll talk a bit more about this in a second, a relatively stiff centre section, and then 2 curving limbs, so that at full draw, this bow describes like a letter D, okay? It's got horn nocks. We're not going to talk about the nocks in this video, but I will in a future video because there are some differences there. And characteristically, they pretty much always have a handle on. Now, when I've been looking through medieval manuscripts, certainly English and French ones, the areas of the 100 Years' War, I have never ever found a picture of a longbow with a handle on it. Okay, so one of the first things, if you're watching a movie or you're watching even reenactors or whatever, if their longbow has a handle wrapping in the middle, that's usually, not always, but it's usually a giveaway that the type of bow they're using is probably not completely historically accurate, and that it's probably what I would term here now a 19th century style longbow. That is because this is the type of bow that people did recreational archery with in the Georgian and Victorian periods, 18th, 19th century. So a handle is the first indicator. The next indicator is that the back of the bow is very flat, okay? Really, really flat, almost like just like a flat piece of applied veneer. And there's a reason for that. That's because very often it is. If you look at this bow, you can see there's two very distinct colours, dark, light. And that is because that front strip is a separate piece of wood to the dark back. So this is a laminate. This is actually a laminate bow. Now, there's no evidence that we know of before the 16th century. There's some suggestion in Roger Ascham's work, I believe, that maybe people were starting to experiment with laminates in the 16th century, but there's no medieval example we know of from Europe of people making a laminate longbow, okay, with more than one piece of wood. They just simply used the natural laminate with the sapwood and the heartwood. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, and indeed for most modern longbows, do consist of more than one piece of wood, because it's a more surefire way of making an effective and quick reflex longbow. You're creating the laminate rather than looking for a natural laminate. Also, yew wood is more difficult to source in the modern world. It's quite expensive, it's fairly limited, endangered in some areas. So you can use other types of wood, and by using them in conjunction, for example, very often a hickory laminate on the back of the bow here, and the belly then of a harder wood. They work very well together, and you can create that laminate, essentially manufacture it. Okay, so very often these are laminates, very flat back, usually a handle section, but there's a more important difference that lots of people don't know. Lots of people who don't do archery don't know. And that is the 18th and 19th, and for most of the modern world, longbow forms a D section when you draw it. That means that when you pull that string, what's happening is this limb, as we call it, because you've got one limb, two limbs, and modern recurve bows that are used in the Olympics, for example, have what's called a riser in the middle, a stiff section in the middle. It's just a handle, doesn't bend at all, and then a bendy limb and a bendy limb, and they can be taken apart into pieces, which is quite useful for transport. But with a longbow of this type, you have a similar thing. You have a stiff central section, and essentially this part of the bow doesn't really work. It doesn't really do anything, and it remains stiff, like a stiff stick in the middle of the bow, and then this limb bends and this limb bends. The big difference is with a medieval warbow, as it's commonly called, but we can call it a longbow as well. It is what's known as a full compass bow. That means when you pull the string, the entire stick is supposed to be curving as part of a circle. So very, very different. At full draw, this bow should form part of a circle, and I can actually very slightly feel the bow flexing in the center section as I draw it back. Whereas with the Victorian style or Georgian style longbow, it's completely stiff in the middle, and it's only the top and bottom limbs bending. Now, pros and cons. Quite simply, these bows with a stiff central section and limbs at each end that bend are reckoned by most people to give a more pleasant shooting experience, because when you release the string, you have you have a stiffer central section that you're holding, and so it's stiffer and more stable and perhaps more accurate. However, you might think, well, why didn't the medieval people do that then? I believe, and I'd be very interested to know if any of you disagree with this, but it is the strongest and most likely theory that I can come up with. I believe the reason they went for a full compass bow with these warbows is because they're dealing with heavier draw weights. Usually these recreational longbows are, 40, 50, 60 pounds draw weight. I know some people only shoot 30 pounds, which for, shooting at a target 30 yards away is fine. but these recreational bows very rarely go above, for example, 65, 70 pounds draw weight. Mine there is actually 70, and that's quite high for a modern type or 19th century style longbow. War bows tend to start at about 70 pounds, and you know, the historical ones we know about, as I've mentioned from the Mary Rose, seem to be more like 120, 140 pounds, all the way up to 200 pound draw weight. And if you're making a bow that has to be able to flex with that degree of stiffness and not break, then you can't only be having a small amount of flex here and a small amount of flex here. It would put too much strain and too much pressure on the upper and lower limbs. I believe that if you want to get that amount of stiffness and power into a very heavy bow, pulling in many cases twice as many pounds, twice as much draw weight as one of these, you have to distribute that evenly throughout the stick, essentially, okay, to reduce the chances of it breaking. So there we go. I'm going to wrap up there. There is a lot more I could say about bows, long bows in particular, and I will do. But really, I suppose the summary of this video is to say, don't confuse the 19th century target longbow with the medieval warbow, essentially. They are very similar and they are cousins, but they are not the same thing. They're constructed differently, they're shaped differently. When they're at full draw, they look different and they shoot differently as well. And indeed, the Victorian bow may well be better for target work at lower draw weights, and warbow designs tend, in my experience, to not work very well at lower draw weights. But at higher draw weights, this design existed like this for a reason, and it clearly did its job very, very well, because various nations all over Europe sought to employ English longbowmen in the 14th and 15th centuries, and even into the 16th century, and they were very, very highly rated. And whilst we can talk in a future video again about the topic of arrows versus armour and this kind of thing, the fact is that however longbowmen in that period were deployed and used, they were clearly super effective at whatever they did. And clearly the bows operating very well were a part of that. But just remember that the bow itself is not specific to England or even to that period. Inherently the longbow is something that has existed way back into prehistory, and we can find examples in archaeology over a very wide area and a very long period of time. So it is one of man's most ancient weapons, and probably this weapon ensured man's survival against nature over a very large part of this planet. Cheers, folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon, or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.